Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Smith, and you are listening to The Wayward Wanderer. Welcome back. Today, I'm going to be talking a bit about the concept of living tradition and why this is a critical idea in radical heathenry and the way of fire and ice, what this is, what it is not, and what this means for the modern practitioner. If you enjoy this podcast and the material that is being provided here, please think about visiting my Patreon and throwing $5 in the can. The address is patreon.com/waywardwanderer. $5 a month gets you advanced access to all podcast episodes, and as the podcast grows and I pick up more patrons, it will include additional benefits like bonus episodes that are only available to patrons. I would also like to give a big thank you to Valerie Heron, who created the new and lovely art assets that you are now seeing on this podcast, both the avatar image and the banner. So big shout out to Valerie Heron. Please check out her work and throw her some love. So let's get right into it. Living tradition, as I define it in the way of fire and ice, means that the emphasis of modern pagan and heathen spirituality should be on finding the best ways possible to adapt pre-Christian practices to the present day in ways that best serve the needs of practitioners as the primary goal. Now, this may be something that sounds very simple and straightforward, but as I'm going to get into in a bit, there are definitely quite a few moving parts here, and there's a lot that's going on. There are some who might see the concept of living tradition as a free pass to do whatever it is you want and potentially even make things up as you go along, while there are others who may find, some critics may even go so far as to claim that living tradition is permission to distort, misrepresent, or in other ways twist the historical record to fit the goals and preconceived notions of the practitioner. This, as I see it, is a bit of an unfair take and is one that does not fully engage with the depths of what living tradition is and represents. And it tends to distract from what we know of the pre-Christian inhabitants of Scandinavia, what their society was like, as well as generally how the field of history has developed over time and treats peoples from these periods where we have a distinct lack of what could be described as internally produced written sources. And what I mean by that is written documents that have survived to the present day where members of that culture are describing the ideas and perspectives of their society in their terms. A good example of such an internal document would be the Annals of Tacitus, which are an extensive history of the Roman Empire and provide Tacitus's internal, as a member of the Roman Empire, not just a member, but a member of the Roman aristocracy at that, and his perspectives on how Roman history had developed, the shortcomings of various emperors, and there are certainly quite a few places where, for those who are familiar with Tacitus, he gets a bit tabloid journalistic. One could say the closest we see to that in heathen sources are the Eddas and the Heimskringla. However, these are both, as far as anyone can tell, small fragments of what was most likely a much larger body of material. And in both cases, were either compiled by post conversion authors or completely written by, as is the case with the Heimskringla and the Prose Edda, Christian authors who were influenced by the ideas of the society that they were living in, and these were ideas that were distinctly different from the societies they were describing. These are important factors in discussing living tradition, as is the very observable tendency in all religions that are currently practiced around the world today to grow, change, and develop over time. Even though there are fundamentalists within Christianity, as well as the Salafi movement within Islam, elements of the ultra-Orthodox community in Judaism, as well as many other similar sects in other religious movements around the world who claim to represent the true and fundamental interpretation of the source material, even these movements are themselves much more modern in their actual origins than they care to admit. And in some ways, their interpretations, particularly fundamentalist evangelical Christianity's tendency to elevate Satan to being almost on par with God, would have been considered heresy even 100 years ago and are considered heretical opinions by other denominations. And it is based on this, as well as what we know of the pre-Christian peoples, that living tradition sets its foundation. And I do want to stress, before really getting into at least my argument for the validity of living tradition and why this is a concept that, even if you don't necessarily take with all of what I put forward in my book, or generally what's developing within radical heathenry as your practice, that this is at least something that is worth considering and wrestling with, even if ultimately your conclusion is, nope, this is not for me. So what I do want to be clear here is what I'm presenting is my opinion and my ideas on this, and I don't want this necessarily to be seen as writ or dogma, or this is absolutely the way it must be done. This is simply one of many ways that you can do heathenry, and is the way that I feel is best for developing a healthy and vibrant practice. So all of that fun disclaimer stuff out of the way, I'm going to dig right into what my arguments are for living tradition. Now, as I said earlier, the emphasis of living tradition is on serving the needs of practitioners. And what this means is more than simply conforming to people's existing expectations or finding ways to reinforce what they already believed, as this could be seen as a potential application of living tradition or interpretation by those who criticize it. What I argue here is rather that the needs of the practitioner are a bit broader than simply doing what feels best. And it's about centering interpretations and development of spiritual praxis on creating healthy and sustaining communities. What this especially means is putting the power to develop praxis in the hands of practitioners and taking it away from any individuals, cliques, or small groups who would claim to be the most authentic or the most informed or the anointed, in whatever way they choose to use that terminology, who are fit to determine what the lore means, what the gods desire, and how to best be in right relationship with the powers. This is something that I feel is important. Like, it is necessary for our form of spirituality to develop in ways that is centered on people's needs. And when I'm saying needs, I mean things like safety, ability to practice in a way that most fully meets the challenges that they are facing, in a way that authentically provides answers rooted in people's experiences in the present day. And part of this is, of course, rooted in that we live in very different social and material conditions than the peoples of pre-Christian Scandinavia, and these significantly divergent material conditions are part of why adaptation is necessary. That said, I am a heathen, so clearly there is something to these ideas and the lore of what survives. Otherwise, I wouldn't be banging on about this or making a podcast or writing books on the topic. So why then reach back to this if the point of living tradition is to create spirituality that meets people's needs and is adapted to the modern age? Well, I think that there are a lot of ways that what we see in the source material, as well as how the pre-Christian Scandinavian peoples lived, that particularly the Norse peoples, that holds up a mirror to modern society and challenges a lot of our assumptions about what should be valued, how relationships should be built, what is important in community, where power really comes from, and how we should move forward as a society. And while certainly there are many things from the past that are worth leaving in the past, like human sacrifice, slavery, and the circumstances that did give rise to centralized kingships, there were still many things of these societies, like the mass-based assemblies, the significantly different gender roles that were very far removed from conventional, hard, masculine-feminine binaries that define the modern world and are themselves a surprisingly modern invention in spite of their claims of ancient pedigree. And most importantly, in empowering the individual and the community to make their own way based on what it is that they feel best serves their needs. So, where does this all come from? Part of it is a reflection of the societies that inspire modern heathenry. Now, it is important when we are talking about the Norse peoples, their Sami neighbors, and other groups in Scandinavia that we understand some key factors about life in those times. When we are discussing these cultures, one thing they all have in common is they are all what is referred to as pre-literate oral societies. What this means is the way information was understood, transmitted, and shared was based literally on word of mouth. This is why skalds, who were sort of like the bards of pre-conversion Scandinavia, as well as during the conversion period and for some time after, were so important and valued in society, because they were sort of like historians, journalists, and publicists all rolled into one. They were the memory and the messengers of accepted ideas and practices within the community. They, as well as the word of others, were how knowledge of different deeds and actions were spread, and the way that developments traveled across the region. This represents a very different understanding of knowledge and information than we see in literate societies, where information is transmitted primarily through the written word and based on the expectations of the written word. Even in the present day, where it is safe to say that the internet has effectively devoured all other forms of media, and mass media has become something of a massive hybrid of what used to be multiple distinct forms of media. The foundation of this is still in written documentation, writing, and recorded videos, sound, what have you, all of which is stuff that exists in a fixed form. This is something that does not exist when you're talking pre-literate societies. Now, this isn't to say that in pre-literate societies that meant people were free to make things up as they go along. In fact, there's research into more contemporary examples of pre-literate societies that show there is a surprising amount of resiliency that exists within oral traditions, as well as research into folklore and other things that are sort of vestiges of this form of information passage. Whether you're talking the resilience of very particular rhymes and songs among children or the durability of various different urban legends, we see vestiges of this and a certain tendency for these things to be self-reinforcing, because oral tradition was something that was built not just by the people who were seen as the most esteemed holders of knowledge, but also by all the people who were participating in these conversations and in these societies. If, for example, somebody, like, say, in a schoolyard is starting to sing any, variation of the, like, Batman Smells Jingle Bells song, and there is sort of an accepted way in that particular school or that particular class that you're supposed to sing that song, and somebody starts singing it incorrectly, other kids are going to say, nah, that's not the way you're supposed to do it. Or if somebody's telling the famous urban legend of Bloody Mary, and somebody says, well, what you're supposed to do is turn on the tap water twice and say her name, somebody might be like, nah, you're supposed to do it 3 times. A simple example, but it suffices for the sake of this discussion. And what this represents is a creation of knowledge that is consensual, but is also adaptive, and is one that varies considerably from place to place. We have evidence in many different sagas that have survived, as well as in surviving folklore, that far from there being a concept of a single centralized notion of what the gods were and what the big stories were, as well as who was associated with what, that there's actually quite a bit of variation in Scandinavia as to who was associated with what. One particularly well-known example among heathens is tendencies in some regions of Scandinavia to hold up Freyr as the primary fertility deity, which is one that's held true in modern day practice for the most part, while there were other regions that would hold up Thor, particularly as the bringer of rain, as the main bringer of fertility and the god who gave life to the soil each spring. There's also many other similar variations that we find. For example, the theories regarding Tyr and whether Tyr once ruled the gods before being supplanted by Odin is one that is disputed by that there seems to be evidence that Tyr was held in greater esteem, or at least a god similar to Tyr, in continental Germany than was the case in Scandinavia. And this is possibly not so much a question of one god supplanting the other within an amorphous canon of sorts, but is more a matter of that within Scandinavia, the various Odin worshipping groups were much more dominant, whereas the groups we'd associate with the continental equivalent to Tyr were much more dominant in those regions. These are debates that are, of course, always ongoing, because we do have a certain lack of these sort of internal written sources that have survived to the present day. As much as oral tradition has a certain beauty to it, and particularly in its organic, evolving, but consensually maintained nature, it does present certain challenges to historians, particularly in that it is somewhat difficult to pin down, and if the people who are holding the oral tradition are wiped out or suppressed in some way or another, it may not survive in the same way that a written document could potentially survive tucked away in the back shelf of a monastery's archives, which is actually a thing that's happened quite frequently with some of these ancient documents. Probably one of the best examples of that was how the Code of Justinian was sort of lost by medieval monks, only to be recovered in I believe it was the 12th century, when some monk was digging around through the archives and went, oh, here's a surviving copy of a fairly up-to-date version of the Roman law code. This is kind of interesting. Let's disseminate this as quickly as we can. Another thing that is important when we're talking about living tradition, as well as these different pre-literate societies, is the notion of canon. Spelled with one N, not two. The two N's one are the things you use to knock down walls and sink ships. The one N one is when we're talking about the acceptance of an idea as being the truth, or at least accepted as part of a particular genre or milieu. The most familiar examples of canon are in religions, where there are accepted interpretations and documents that are held up as particularly sacrosanct, and some that are not. We can see debates with this within Christianity that date back to the Council of Nicaea. There's similar debates within Islam over the validity of different hadiths. There's even debates over texts that are accepted by, for example, all of the different denominations of Protestant Christianity, over how one is supposed to interpret those texts and what they mean. So canon is something that is important when we're talking about living tradition as well as oral cultures, particularly that the entire concept of canon is one that, as far as anyone can tell, and it is entirely possible some document may be unearthed that proves me wrong on this point, but at time of recording, there does not seem to have been any notion of defined canon in Scandinavia. This is not unusual, by the way. There also does not seem to have been any notion of this is the set defined canon in, for example, South Asian practices that are commonly referred to as Hinduism, with many different sects and interpretations that draw on a number of core texts that nonetheless are interpreted in many different ways. In ancient Greece and Rome, there was something probably closer to canon in the form of the imperial cult, but even then there was still a considerable range of interpretation, and particularly in classical Greece, there were many different interpretations of different gods, as well as emphases on different aspects in different cities, depending on who was most favored, which aspect was seen as most desirable by those inhabitants, and many of them had different names, as well as different local variations on a lot of common themes. This is what happens when you have a very organic, developing sense of how spirituality works, and also seems to be quite common in many parts of the world, as far as anyone can tell. Canonicity is something that requires a centralized authority to create. And the first example we have of this kind of deliberate creation of canon comes with the Council of Nicaea in the 300s. To give an extremely abbreviated version, because there are historians who have written reams of text on this who go into much more detail as far as the particulars, and the Da Vinci Code has also given a somewhat, hackneyed, messy understanding of this important historical event. The Council of Nicaea was the moment where the Bible of Christianity as we know it came into existence. Now, this is something that I cannot emphasize enough. The Bible, as we know it, was a thing that was created by fiat of a council that was assembled by the Roman Emperor Constantine for the purpose of creating a single defined set of beliefs for the new religion. Prior to the Council of Nicaea, there were multiple different gospels and documents that were circulating throughout the Mediterranean world. There were even some that had a high degree of popularity, which were ultimately rejected by Nicaea as not being in line with the interpretations of that council. For one particularly interesting fact, the book of Revelations, which is probably one of the more famous books of the Bible and gets absolutely heavy metal fairly quickly with things like seven-headed beasts and four horsemen and all kinds of imagery that has resonated throughout modern culture ever since, was in fact one of the more controversial additions to canon. And what is important to understand about this process, without getting too much into the weeds, is the Council of Nicaea was not something that came about as a result of Christian bishops going, well, we need to really clean this up and come up with something nice and consistent and neat, but happened, as I said, because the Emperor Constantine said, okay, we're going to clean this up and we're going to create a single accepted version of this religious practice. This is going to be the way Christianity is. And he put the power of the imperial government behind that, both by defunding pagan temples across the empire and providing lavish support, including force and violence, to the Christian bishops and churches who specifically hewed to the Nicene Creed and its interpretations. One of the first groups of Christians, in fact, to come under the axe from this were what was referred to as Arian, spelled Arian, not the other Arian, which is something I'll get into in a different episode, Christianity, which held to a different interpretation of the nature of Christ. This notion of canonicity was something that, and I cannot emphasize enough, was imposed from above and maintained through force. Full stop. And this is important when we're understanding living tradition, as well as understanding these kind of pre-literate societies that inspire modern heathenry. That any notion of something being canon, as far as we can tell, did not exist, because there was no such body that imposed such an idea. What further complicates any notion of there being a clear heathen canon, to use the word in air quotes for a minute there, is that we know there was considerable variation in local legends, myth, interpretations, how stories were told, which gods were important, all kinds of stuff. This is why living tradition is grounded in historical inspiration, in my opinion. It makes no sense to me for modern practitioners to say this set of documents, which we know were composed over the course of a 300-year time period, where considerable social change, upheaval, conflict, and ultimately the demise of this form of spiritual practice was happening. What these surviving sources are is fragments of a much larger tradition, one that will probably remain largely unknown because so little of it survived in a direct documented way or otherwise intact in a way that could be described as representative of the practices and ideas of the peoples of pre-Christian Scandinavia and pre-Christian Norse societies. And what this all represents is a developing, growing, and organic body of information where what was accepted as part of spiritual practice was an ongoing process and discussion that was happening within these communities and among the peoples who were following these different forms of spirituality, and the variations that, while drawing from a general same source of inspiration, nonetheless saw quite a degree of variance and adaptation to specific local and regional conditions. One such example can be seen in references to Thor being invoked to ward off from volcanic eruptions in Iceland, as opposed to in his usual role as god of thunder, because climate-wise, there's not very much in the way of thunder and lightning that happens in Iceland, but there is quite a bit, at least compared to other parts of Scandinavia, but there is this thing called volcanic eruptions, which are quite frequent. So we could see that these were peoples that were changing and adapting how they viewed and understood these things based on their circumstances. It therefore makes sense that we do the same thing, and that as much as the original source material is an invaluable resource and starting point for understanding, it is a beginning and not the sum total of how we understand and experience the powers. This, I think, brings the conversation round to the subject of how living tradition interacts with history, the historical record, archaeological sources, and all of these other source materials that are used by modern heathens as well as other pagans for developing a core for existing spiritual practice. Even though living tradition emphasizes adapting to our present conditions and finding the best ways possible to apply what we know of these various societies to the dilemmas of the present and find ways to develop our spirituality in a way that has relevance in the modern world, I still think it is necessary for things to be grounded heavily in historical sourcing, at least as an initial starting point. The relationship is more one of using history as a source of inspiration, as I mentioned before, a springboard. It also is grounded in an understanding to an extent of how the writing of history is done, and that history is something that in a scholarly context, which is something that unfortunately tends to get lost when it reaches a larger popular audience for a variety of reasons, ranging from academics can be just kind of absolutely terrible at explaining things in terms that make sense to a general audience, to that how history is used in broader society, particularly by different political actors, tends towards a serious distortion, is that history is really more of a debate over what we understand about the past than it is necessarily a fixed, this is the way things were. There are loads of examples in the discipline of history where the writing and understanding of specific periods and locations and times have been completely upended by new discoveries or by challenges to the existing narratives, by pointing out things like groups that are left out, such as women, people of marginalized racial or ethnic minorities, people who are members of different religious sects or political movements that were on the outs with the existing power structure, all kinds of things. And it's these kinds of challenges, as well as discovery of new sources, as well as re-examination of existing sources with an eye towards the bias within the sources, as well as the bias of previous interpretations, that has constantly sort of refertilized this very active ground for intellectual discussion. This, incidentally, doesn't jive very well with folks who are either used to or actively use history as a way of justifying what it is they're doing or just understanding the world.
Because after all, it is a lot easier to say, well, this is the way things were. Why? Because it's in this book, and this book was written by a doctor / professor, take your pick, whichever title, and that gives it authority, therefore it is right, as opposed to understanding that what's actually in this book is more like, so here's what the professor or doctor or researcher, what have you, understands about this period based on these available sources, and this is part of a much bigger conversation with lots of other people who are writing similar things about those different time periods. There are some topics that get a lot of attention because of people going into particular fields based on what's happening in the world for them right now. There's histories that are very much written as a response to what is happening in current events. One particularly excellent, like classical example of this from political history is a book called 12 Who Ruled, which is a history of the French Revolution. And it talks about the Committee for Public Safety, you know, the guys that were running around with guillotines and Robespierre and all of them, were chopping off heads and all that jazz. At least, you know, that's the short version anyway. The book itself is a lot more interesting if you're so inclined. But what's important about it for this discussion is not our opinions about the French Revolution and the sans-culottes or whatever, but that it was written on the eve of the Second World War, just as the invasion of Poland had commenced, and the Nazis were gearing up to invade France. And so this kind of comes out of this context of people in the English-speaking world are looking at what's happening in continental Europe, and to an extent there is a bit of, oh shit, here we go again. It looks like we're repeating the mistakes of the Great War and these other times. And the author there is not necessarily explicitly so, but to an extent saying, well, we've been through these kind of times of, you know, societal madness, if you will, and we'll get through this again, don't worry. And it leads to like an interesting analysis. And, you know, the book isn't bad, and it's definitely an interesting history in its own right, but this context is important to keep in mind. And this is the same reason why you then see like different waves of scholarship around things like Black America, or like, say, the Middle East following September 11th, or other different like topics that will periodically get a lot of attention because there's things that are pushing people to go, hey, let's ask questions about this. So this idea of history as being this edifice that is built up by the patient labor of researchers squirreled away in ivory towers who are not sullying their hands with the affairs of the world is one that's really not quite accurate. And it's one that especially isn't good for folks like hacks named David Barton and other people on the American Christian right who try to present their misinterpretation, as well as just straight up misrepresentation in some ways, of early American history in ways that are used to justify a very clear political project. So these are all things that are taken into account when you're approaching practice with a living tradition perspective. Is it's knowing that history is not some kind of grand record. It is not this endless project that has been accumulated by the patient labor of brilliant minds who were like untethered from the concerns of their day, but this is like a continuous debate that is constantly being reevaluated and challenged and tested by new waves of scholarship, new discoveries. One of the best examples really of a discovery completely upending history is the fall of the Soviet Union. And this is because before the fall of the Soviet Union, all research around the Soviet Union that was done by people outside of the USSR was limited by the lack of access to primary sources in governmental archives and other similar repositories of information. After the Soviet government collapsed, all of these old archives were opened up for researchers for the first time, and a lot of what was accepted as fact about the Soviet Union came into question because for the first time ever, outside researchers could actually look at the primary sources and archival documents and government records and all this other stuff they just didn't have access to before. And this is a thing that happens all the time as new documents or new records or new archaeological discoveries. Like, for example, the famous discovery of the anatomically female warrior grave in Sweden, which completely upends all kinds of assumptions that shield maidens and women fighting was largely a literary invention and not something that actually had any basis in fact, and is also something that jives with similar graves that have been re-examined in the north of England. And some scholars like Neil Price go so far as to say, well, you know what? We don't actually necessarily know what the gender identity was of this person. We know anatomically they appear to be what we would describe as a woman according to modern standards, but this could have been someone who would fit into many other potential like gender identities, like gender queer or gender fluid or possibly like transmasculine. We don't know because we don't have enough sources describing this person's perspective. But as Neil Price argues, these initial facts that are just in that discovery by themselves already open up huge debate. And they open up more because it opens up more possibility for more questions. So this is something that is so incredibly important, I think, in doing any kind of paganism that is based on these different societies for whom we have very limited written documents for, or and have to depend on like a mix of archaeology and folklore along with that to get something approximating a reasonable picture. And it's something that we always have to remember.
Which brings the discussion to, what does this mean for the modern practitioner as far as doing living tradition? What is adaptation versus simply making things up, and what is and is not an acceptable way to handle all of that? What I think is most important and is absolutely essential for living tradition, that's why I think what is most important is just owning what it is you're doing. Whether it is something that you are pointing to as being adapted from existing known source material or is a completely new innovation. Both are perfectly all right as long as you are owning what they are and not trying to pass this off as, well, this is an ancient practice that is based on whatever XYZ reasoning it is that you're using, when it in fact is not. And this lack of ownership is something that has caused serious problems within the community. Like, I would argue that part of why so much of the outright fascist and racist stuff was able to get as far as it did and influence the different forms and methods that people use, like arguably like all of what is associated with like conventional bloat style in the United States, where you have somebody designated as a Valkyrie who passes the horn around and things kind of take on almost a sort of pseudo communion thing and everybody goes one at a time, was something that came out of like fascist interpretations of the sources, without any mention of, oh, by the way, this is just sort of what we slapped together based on these things. And instead it's sort of portrayed as, well, this is just the way you do it, without really digging into what the origins are. And there's many other examples that one can think of, like things like, say, the blank rune that comes with Ralph Blum's interpretation of the Elder Futhark, as well as his other interpretations, which in some ways get a little wonky and go into places that are not really well grounded, especially the whole concept of Merkstav, which seems to largely come from tarot, but is stuff that gets passed off as having some kind of basis in antiquity. And the reason why it's necessary to own this stuff is it's a matter of honesty and integrity. Like, I think there's nothing wrong with saying, yes, we do our bloat where we pass out Dixie cups to everybody that is filled with apple juice up ahead of time, because that's easier logistically to handle, and we want to be inclusive of people who are prefer sobriety for whatever reason, then it's totally fine to say, yes, this is what we do. Why? Because we're adapting to our circumstances, because we can't afford or get a hold of like a drinking horn, and it's more sanitary to use little Dixie cups, not to mention cheaper. Like, that's absolutely all right. Or if you are making, like, say, inferences such as Thor being associated with internet moderators, based on that, you just sort of see this synchronicity running around in internet culture of moderators removing trolls with banhammers. That's totally fine as long as you're owning that this is something that is based on modern supposition and drawing lines and connections based on what we already know. I One particularly big active interpretation that I do in my book is interpreting Loki as a they and as a gender fluid uh, deity, and not as assigning them as male, even though male pronouns are used to describe them in the source material. And this is based on looking at, in my interpretation, Loki does frequently shift between gender roles and do all kinds of outright shapeshifting, including that whole incident involving the horse and Sleipnir, or volunteering to pose as Thor's handmaiden during the Thermsvitka without really anyone's prompting. Just sort of like, hey, I'll totally do that. Like, it does kind of give the impression that for Loki, what their gender expression is entirely depends on what they're feeling and what the immediate circumstances are, and their baseline of gender is probably something that's much more fluid and a lot less in what would be described as conventionally masculine. There's nothing to support that in the source material, by the way, in terms of saying, well, Loki is a they, because there's nothing where Loki is referred to as a they, and we don't have evidence necessarily. And again, this is due to lack of surviving material. I'm not saying that this is therefore lack of existence of gender queer as we understand it today being a thing that existed for the Norse peoples when these myths first developed and then were eventually written down and recorded. What I think, therefore, is important with all of this is that, again, own it. There's nothing wrong with doing modern innovations. There's nothing wrong with saying, well, okay, based on what we can see from the source material, it is reasonable to invoke this particular deity in a very modern context that did not exist in the pre-Christian world. Then, go for it. And if the reason for doing it is that you have source material that you can point to, then point to that source material and say, and this is my interpretation based on this evidence. If there isn't, well, then that's okay too, as long as you are owning that what you're doing is based on your inference. It could be something that came to you in a dream or a flash of inspiration, whatever. That's totally fine. Just please do not try to pass it off as something that has more antiquity than it does. That is something that is both dishonest and in some ways very potentially dangerous, because frequently you will see in not just heathenry, but in the broader pagan community, as well as in the adjacent New Age movement mess thing over there, claims of antiquity being used to give a certain kind of credibility to what people are doing that doesn't actually exist. And then you get into just some really weird, loopy, and outright racist stuff around things like aliens building the pyramids and all that, and it just gets into weird rabbit holes. So instead, just, be upfront, say this is your innovation, this is your interpretation, this is your inference, and you're doing it this way because it works, because it feels appropriate, and it feels appropriate in a very similar way to Thor being invoked for volcanoes in Iceland instead of for thunder, because of necessary environmental adaptations to circumstances, as well as what had become the most immediate symbol of something that was potentially dangerous and devastating for the peoples in that environment. This then brings the question back to the whole issue of canon and deciding what is and is not accepted as part of shared practice within a particular community. If in radical heathenry we are trying to get away from canon and the tendencies towards top down authorities defining spirituality for its practitioners, then living tradition should therefore stay very far away from having any notion of, like, say, a specific guild or position or organization or anything similar that has the power or is vested with the authority, voluntary or otherwise, to decide what is and is not a correct interpretation of practice. And the answer to this dilemma is actually very simple. If we are going to be drawing inspiration from what was clearly a body of oral custom and tradition and practice that was disseminated and co-created by the peoples of this time and place, and is now being disseminated and co-created by practitioners today, then the answer as to what could be considered canon in air quotes, and really we need to come up with a better word for that, maybe something like shared practice or accepted interpretation, or I don't know, someone's going to come up with some nice term. Maybe I'll figure it out eventually, or someone will come up with a much better buzzword for it. But leaving that aside for a minute, is by the community engaging in that same process where what becomes accepted interpretation and accepted practice is mediated through all participants, from the newest and most inexperienced individuals to the most informed and long practicing, and everything in between, engaging in discussion, sharing their experiences, sharing their perspectives, and arriving at something of a consensus around different interpretations, as well as reaching a point of saying, okay, those are certain interpretations that we're going to just agree to disagree on, but are ones that can still exist within the same space. Now, of course, this also leaves quite a bit of space for a community to decide, therefore, certain clearly harmful interpretations, such as anything that comes out of the white nationalist movement or the Asatru Folk Assembly or the Odinic Rite, are not acceptable in this community, because that is a decision that's being reached by the community and its members, and is not something that is simply being decreed by an appointed elite that is expected to be followed by everyone else. And the reason why I think it's important that even for things that are as essential as affirming inclusion and standing against fascism and for something better and something that really uplifts and empowers people's lives in a genuine way, is that it is necessary, if we are going to truly be building community along those lines, to not recreate the structures and institutions of other religious practices that have led to so much abuse and harm over the course of the last 1,000 years at the bare minimum. And the best way, I think, to do this is building community and practice in a way where everyone has a voice in developing that practice, in having input on the way that we interpret these myths and apply them in the present day, and the way that we develop ritual and community organization and everything. And it needs to always be bottom up. It needs to be something that is participatory, and it needs to be something that brings in as many viewpoints, with the obvious exceptions of those who are seeking harm and bad faith towards others, or actively fighting against these core inclusive and participatory principles. Because after all, it is well within any community's right to say, we are excluding those who clearly mean harm to our way of practice, and we are not required by the standards of inclusivity to let in just anybody, especially if the just anybody who wants to come in is actively saying, "Hi, I would like to come into your house so I can start rigging it up with explosives and knock it flat and build a block of some really ugly condos next to a concentration camp," or something like that. Is perfectly all right for communities as part of developing their shared experience and practice to include defending the broader framework, so long as that is being done in a way that provides buy-in and space for everybody who agrees on those broader principles. So I think that just about wraps things up for this episode. Thank you for listening in on this deep dive into the concept of living tradition. And again, if you enjoyed this podcast and you want to see more material and you want advanced access to this material, I consistently always release all of my regular episodes 1 week in advance for my patrons. And the more patrons I get, the more added bonus content will be coming out of this podcast. Please visit my Patreon at www.patreon.com/waywardwanderer. Again, the address is www.patreon.com/waywardwanderer. You can also find a link on the SoundCloud and on my other various social media outlets. So thank you again. And this has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer.